Good evening and welcome to DTV, a community television program expressing democratic values for Knox County viewers. My name is Reverend Renee Kesler and I'm delighted to be your host this evening. I am the president of the Beck Cultural Exchange Center and the host tonight for DTV's Black History Month. Well, this special edition is very special because tonight we have a very special guest joining us, and probably personally one of the people that I admire the most, Mr. Robert Booker. And this evening we get an opportunity to sit down and have a conversation with Mr. Robert Booker about a fascinating new book, and he says his final book, From the Bottom Up.
From the bottom up.
Welcome, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, thank you. I appreciate that because it's a publication I've worked on for almost 30 years, I guess. I started and stopped. It was something that was very close to my heart, but I wasn't quite ready to finish it. So I added to it and took it back, put it on a back burner and a further back burner until finally I got it off the press.
Well, Mr. Booker, you know that Beck is the place where African American history and culture are preserved. And I always consider it an honor and a privilege to be there and to be the keeper of this rich history, and particularly because truly I stand on your shoulders as the predecessor to Beck. And when I'm thinking about this book, I'm looking at it, I'm reading it, I'm thinking about all of the amazing books you've written. But I'm asking myself, why is this one so special?
Well, this one is so special because it's history through my own eyes. The other books I've done them from a pure historical context, from reading other books, from reading newspaper items. But this is the kind of history I've lived. And I think there are significant moments in that history that I've lived, and I wanted to describe them as I saw them while it was happening. So that's the difference, I think.
All right, so now you've piqued all of the audience's interest, and I've looked at it. So if I ask you, what's the most interesting story that you experienced and shared in this book, without giving away all of the book, because they do need to come to the Beck and purchase the book, but just give us a glimpse of that one story that really...
Well, there are so many in my mind. I'm so pleased with the book that I was able to dig up a number of things that should interest people. But one that stands in my mind was when I was a member of the state legislature as a Democrat and voted for Bill Jenkins, who was a Republican, for Speaker of the House, and he won. And I was kind of an outcast. A U.S. congressman called me a renegade SOB. And I love that moniker, so I have a chapter in there called the Renegade SOB, except it's spelled out because this U.S. congressman called me that. And the significance of that for me is that I have always been that way.
You've always been an SOB?
Yes, I've always marched to the tune of a different drummer. I was ahead of my time. I was the first to do a lot of things. And so that chapter describes who I am, because it not only talks about me as a member of the legislature, it talks about my experience as a public school teacher where I didn't take a bunch of stuff. I didn't take a bunch of stuff when I was in college. And in some of my jobs, I didn't take a bunch of stuff, so they told me, you're out of here. So that's very important to me.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to give away the chapter because that is good, but I love how you were just, in this book, very authentic, very open, and very real. So I think that you exposed yourself, and that's fair to say, and people get an opportunity to see that inside. A part of really Bob Booker that many people may or may not know.
Well, I am who I am. You know, when I was in elective politics, I did what I thought was right. I didn't do what I thought would get me reelected. I learned that if I did right, I would be reelected. So I didn't have to worry about how am I going to go on this or what am I going to say about that. Just follow my gut and do what was in my heart. And I was never defeated in the state legislature because of that.
I love it. Certainly some words of wisdom for today for
Sure.
many of our politicians. And so let's go back, because the thing I love about this book is it really chronicles your life in that place, in that space. So you called the book From the Bottom Up. So let's start from the
All right,
bottom.
from the bottom
Yeah.
up. The title comes from the neighborhood that I lived in. I lived down in the bottom, which was in essence Knoxville's largest ghetto. 99.9% black people lived there. Many of the people who worked had menial jobs. A few worked on the railroad, a couple were school teachers maybe. But it was a very poor conglomeration of neighborhoods. And First Creek rose every spring and ran many of us out of there. We had to find alternate routes to go to school or to go to the movie house or to do whatever. But it was a place where people felt safe, even though crime went on there, especially in the pool rooms where people were cut or shot, that kind of thing. I don't know that there were a lot of robberies because there was nothing to rob. You know, the most well-to-do people we saw were, let me put it this way. We thought the well-to-do people were school teachers and preachers,
Sure.
but they didn't make any money. It was the bootleggers and the numbers runners who made the money. And a lot of that was going on down in the bottom, and we accepted it as a way of life. You either made less than minimum wage or you were in the numbers business or the liquor business.
Wow. So then who were your influential role models?
At that point, it were my school teachers, because those were the people who understood what life was like on the outside. They didn't know that integration or desegregation was coming, but they did everything to prepare us for it. Even with the songs that we sang, Stephen Collins Foster had a lot of great songs, Jeannie with the light brown hair, and all of those great songs, but some were a little bit demeaning. Old Black Joe perhaps was not demeaning, but you wondered about that. But when we came to lyrics in those songs like Dark Is, the teachers would change that word to people, because dark is was a demeaning term. So our teachers tried to shield us from racial segregation as much as they could. We want you to be happy, and we want you to be prepared to step in a world where there won't be racial segregation in the future. And they really got us ready for that.
Well, that just kind of rolls into a conversation I'd like to transition into with respect to education, because we just had this conversation. In fact, last evening at the Beck, we were having a conversation about segregation and integration, and specifically, we were talking about Austin High School
Yes.
and East High School, and then, of course, the class of 1969 was included, which would make up the first graduating class of Austin East High School. And so can you share with us, and some of the things you shared within the book, about the experience of Austin High School as an all-black high school, and also sort of the impact that education has had on your life?
Well, first of all, let me say this. The Board of Education and the hierarchy in education really believed in fair play for everybody. Our school system, we were segregated from the white schools, but they said, even so, let's give them the best we can give them. So they found the best teachers they could find, and that was a reference made last night. We had the very best teachers money could buy. My English teacher couldn't write for Time magazine. My science teacher couldn't work for Westinghouse. And on down the line, they had to teach us rather than getting into those big time positions. So
not that they couldn't, but they didn't.
Well, in those days they couldn't work for Westinghouse.
Sure.
They couldn't write for Time.
But very well could have.
They could. They had the ability.
Absolutely.
Indeed,
Okay,
they had the ability.
Mm-hmm.
So we had four of the best English teachers in the city of Knoxville. Whether it was my 9th grade, 10th, 11th, 12th grade year, we had the best teachers. We excelled in sports. We had to play each other. We couldn't play white teams. But Austin High won the National Negro Football Championship 4 times. I believe 1940, 42, and 43 during that time frame. In basketball, we came very close to winning those national championships. But everything was equal. We didn't worry about just playing basketball or football. We had to excel academically because they demanded that of us. And also, what a part of that was that those teachers knew everybody in the community. Many of them had taught my mother or my grandmother.
Okay.
So they knew how to, whether we didn't have telephones, but they sure knew how to come by your house.
What about that?
And because we lived in that village.
Yeah.
So that I think was the difference in some problems we're having today in our schools.
I got you. Sort of that village concept, that community concept where everyone sort of looked out for each other.
Indeed, no question about that.
So then transition that, because another big part of your life with respect to education would certainly be Knoxville College. And there's that old saying I hear people talking about, K through KC, if you will. Tell us about that transition to the HBCU in its heyday here in Knoxville.
Well, it was a great experience. Of course, I had a little gap between that. When I finished high school, I joined the Army. And I spent 3 years in the Army, and I had the chance to deal with white boys. I'd always been with black guys in classes, but suddenly I'm thrown amongst a bunch of white people who had much more experience than I'd had. I don't know why, but my senior class at Austin High voted me the most brilliant boy in the class. But when I compared with those guys in the Army who'd gone to school elsewhere, I found that I wasn't so smart. And I found myself checking books out of the library. I found myself suddenly reading Time magazine that I'd never done before to catch up on things. And so it really broadened my horizon, not only the association with them, but for the first time I was free from segregation. I could go to any movie I wanted to see. I could go to any restaurant or any other place away from Knoxville. But when I came back to Knoxville in May of 1957, I was back to square one because nothing had changed in Knoxville. And so I enrolled at Knoxville College, that great place upon the hill where they took us and nurtured us according to our abilities. There were some people already who were A students and they could just breeze through the college with no problem. But there were some of us who had not applied ourselves. So Knoxville College gave us tests to make sure where we belonged, and they would give us remedial stuff or whatever to bring us up to par within those 4 years we were there. And then to having been free for 3 years in the Army, when we saw what was going on in Greensboro, North Carolina with A&T students sitting in at lunch counters, we said we should be doing that too. And I happen to be president of the student government. So it fell my lot to corral the students and say, let's get that kind of thing going here in Knoxville. So I guess that transitions into part of the KC story.
Well, I love that. And obviously that's another big part of your life, which is the movement and leading that movement. So just keep rolling into that. Tell me about what that experience was like, being the class president at Knoxville College of your peers, and also taking on the weight of this huge movement here in Knoxville.
Well, it was interesting. I perhaps was 4 years older than the average freshman at Knoxville College at that time, so I was a little bit more mature. And I had seen the world, or part of it anyway, where we had some freedom. And I said, Knoxville is no different. We ought to have that same kind of freedom here. So we began to organize the sit-in movement and at lunch counters, and we had stand-ins at downtown theaters and marches and whatever. And even though the more mature community said, we don't think that's the way to go, you know, we have great race relations here in Knoxville, so why don't we negotiate with those lunch counter owners and we can get things solved more peacefully? Well, we thought that was great if they could do it, but we didn't believe they could. We believed that the downtown store owners were just giving lip service and waiting for Knoxville College to close for the summer, and then they didn't have to worry about it. Well, we came up with the bright idea, let's make them know we're serious. So after leaving chapel one morning, we jumped into a bunch of our cars and drove into downtown Knoxville and just walked through all of the stores that had lunch counters. Now, we were wise enough to call the newspapers and the TV stations to let them know, and sure enough, we were captured marching through. So that's what we did, and eventually we had to have sit-ins because the negotiations, which I don't think ever took place to begin with, just didn't work.
But finish that story, because I remember you telling me the story, because at the back, as you know, there's this great picture of these more senior folks who are carrying the signs of justice and equality, marching down the street. What had you done?
Well, we had kind of opened the door. They followed what we were doing, and they thought the negotiations were going on, but when they discovered they were being hoodwinked too, they decided, well, the students have gone home for the summer, so we're going to go out there and do it ourselves.
Yeah.
So they did.
Yeah, so the students had really incited something.
We got them motivated to do it. We're not going to let them down because we're the ones who told them to slow up.
Yeah.
Let us handle it.
Yeah.
And in the end, they couldn't handle it the way they wanted to.
That's great. And indeed, nothing's changed today, because still young people have that passion and are leading lots of charges.
I love the spunk of those high school students after that recent shooting. It just does my heart good that they're taking the lead in that. They may be too young to vote now, but they won't forget that when they're 18 years old. And I'm sure they will influence their parents.
I was just getting ready to say.
Because vice versa, parents have been influencing them.
Absolutely.
And now parents will stand up and take notice.
I can see them taking the lead and influencing the vote even before they get there.
Indeed.
Absolutely. All of this is very good stuff. And again, just hearing your experiences and then sharing those experiences in the books are great. So I want to switch gears just a little bit, because one of the subjects that's kind of near and dear to my heart, simply because Beck is continuing this sort of tradition or commemoration, and we're about to start working on it, and you talk a little bit about this in the book. The whole idea of this 8th of August in this Chilhowie Park and that kind of rigmarole that was going on. Give us a glimpse of your remembrance of that time.
Oh, the 8th of August, my goodness, that was 4th of July and Christmas rolled into one event. It was the time we could go to Chilhowie Park once a year. Now, people say, well, what was so important about that? If you think about the Tennessee Valley Fair at Chilhowie Park, those 2 weeks it's there, Chilhowie Park was like that all summer because the city of Knoxville owned various rides, Ferris wheels, Dodgem cars, you name it. So there was always the crazy house, the tunnel of love, and things you could do. But we as black people could go there only on the 8th of August. And finally in 1948, we could go there every Thursday. This was the city-owned park that we were denied access to for all of that time. And it's very important for us to remember that we've not been fair to all citizens, even though we get up and pledge allegiance to the flag and liberty and justice for all. But many of us in those days had to say under our breath, liberty and justice for a few, because it was not for all of us in terms of everyday living.
So what was that experience like for you? You said it was great. It was 4th of July and Christmas all wrapped up into one. But just give us, for those who may or may not remember or know anything about this part of the history, what it looked like just for everybody going in at that day.
Well,
or all of the black community.
What we did as youngsters, we began saving our nickels and dimes in the spring. I would chop wood for people. I would carry in coal for people. I had a little red wagon, and I would haul ice from the ice house for people. Many people didn't have refrigerators, Frigidaires as we know them today, so they had to have 25 pounds of ice or 50 pounds. So we made money that way. And that way we could ride all of those things at Chilhowie Park. Now, I never knew why we celebrated the 8th of August until many years later. And I was working at the Beck Center, and I came across this old scrapbook. And there was a man who was a columnist by the name of Patton. And I read his column that said, Andrew Johnson, who was a military governor of Tennessee, freed his personal slaves on the 8th of August, 1863. And blacks in this area and other parts of, around here began celebrating that time as Freedom Day. So that's how it all came about.
So it carried that date all the way through history.
Indeed. Well, East Tennessee, some parts of Kentucky. I don't know how they picked up on it, but they celebrated it as well.
Yeah. So that's a big part of the history of this area, but specifically with respect to Beck, there's another really big part of history that is very important to really the formation and creation of Beck. Here we are 43 years later, after Beck having been created in 1975. And it really, it was really created as a result of a project called Urban Renewal. And it was a federal program. And you talk about that and your experience with that in the book. So share with us, for those who may or may not know, Urban Renewal and then also your part.
Well, Urban Renewal began 1958-59 because we did have a lot of blight. My area that I grew up, the bottom sorely needed urban renewal because most, but nearly all of it was just so dilapidated it needed to be cleared. But I assume there were land speculators and others who figured out a way to make a quick buck, and they just went too far with urban renewal, and they were using federal funds, so they tore down stately homes and that destroyed the black business community completely. Most of our black businesses were on East Vine Avenue, now East Summit Hill, near Central, and all of those were destroyed, never to come back again. So urban renewal did that to us. I was involved only slightly because I began working for the city of Knoxville in 1964, and Mayor Duncan at that time assigned me to the Urban Renewal Office, and I served as a relocation specialist, helping people to find new homes. So I saw it up close from that point of view, and later on I've done as much study as I could to get the facts and figures as to how people were devastated with their businesses. Virtually everybody was put in debt because they gave fair market value for the properties rather than replacement value. And what that meant was if you had a house worth $20,000 in the urban renewal project, the one you bought outside was going to cost you $30,000 or $40,000. So you were put in a hole, even though you had worked all your life and perhaps you really didn't have the income to relocate as you should be able to.
And so how then does that transition to Mr. Booker getting to the Beck?
Well, I was living in Detroit. I moved to Detroit in 1974 as market development manager for the Stroh Brewery. And I read in one of the newspapers that the Beck Center was being established. Well, I really wasn't all that happy in Detroit, so I wrote the people a letter saying that I was interested in becoming the director at the Beck Center. Ironically, they kind of ignored me. They told me later because they said he's making too much money in Detroit and certainly he couldn't come back to Knoxville for the salary that we're offering. So they hired a person as director, and he was there for less than a year because his wife was involved in a national sorority and he wanted to travel with her, so he resigned. And then they hired a second person, and she was there for maybe less than 2 years, and she was unhappy. And by that time, I was moving back to Knoxville. And one of the board members remembered that I had expressed an interest in Beck, so they called and asked if I would have lunch with them at the Trailways bus station on Main Avenue. And I did, and they said, well, the position is going to be available. Are you still interested? I said, yes. And they told me about the chicken feed that they were going to pay me. I said, well, I can handle that. I don't have a family, so I think I can make ends meet with it.
So you really just wanted to get back to Knoxville.
I just wanted to get back to Knoxville, where I was involved. See, in Detroit, I left Detroit mostly every Monday morning and came back Friday afternoon. I knew very few people in Detroit, attended few events in Detroit, but I was a Knoxville person, a people person, and I wanted to get back to that.
Mr. Booker, who's had the most influence on your life?
It's difficult to say because so many have. Those school teachers who got me started off early surely helped me. And there were people like Jack LaFleur, who was vice president of the Johnston Jewelry Company that sold rings for class graduations at Austin High. Jack was a person who served on county commission, very well-dressed guy, very well outspoken, who took no stuff from anybody. I was crazy about Jack. There was another guy who, his name, I'm having a senior moment here, but anyhow, he served as an ambassador to Nigeria, cultural attaché to Japan, assistant secretary of state under Henry Kissinger. He was a 1939 graduate of Austin High School. I knew his name. I had a chance to meet him. He was a great influence on me because I really wanted to go into foreign service. And those two guys in particular influenced me, but I had so many great teachers. It's hard to say who did the most in that area.
Regrets.
Regrets.
What would be the biggest regret?
Oh, regrets. I don't know that I have any. You know, I've thought about that because, you know, as I said, I wanted to go into foreign service. My second choice of work was public relations. My third choice was journalism. My fourth choice was teaching. I did the three of them, never got into foreign government, foreign relations, but I've done well in all the other three, so I have no regrets whatsoever about it. I wouldn't change anything that I've done in my whole life.
Wouldn't take nothing for the journey now.
Nothing at all, nothing.
What's left? So you said to me, Renee, this is it. This is the last book. You've done, I can name them. I mean, you've done The Red Summer, you've done Mechanicsville, you've done East Knoxville, you've done 200 Years of Black History and Culture in Knoxville, Tennessee, you've done Knoxville College Book, you've done the Encyclopedia, you've done now.
I've done the history of my fraternity, I did the history of my church.
What's next?
There's always research. I will always be curious. In fact, when I leave here, I'm going to the History Center and do some research. But as far as a formal publication goes, I have nothing in mind. I will always write. I will always do papers. I will always speak at civic clubs and churches and that kind of thing. But I'm not sure I have anything else to put in a book. Let's put it that way.
Well, we're excited that you've put in so much to the book. I'm truly honored and humbled to even have the opportunity to even just walk in the places where you have walked. And
well, let me say this: you're the greatest thing Beck could attract there. I'm so pleased with the way you are operating the place. I'm so pleased that you brought it into the 21st century with the electronics, the ideas you have, the displays you have. You've taken so much out of archives and put it where people can actually see it. So you've done a tremendous job with the Beck Center.